Thank you so much for making me welcome here and inviting me to Boise. It's already a revelation. I'm just meeting and talking with so many people that it's exciting to hear about ministries going on and interest in other ministries. So really appreciate being here and getting away from the smog where I live. So it's that season. So I just thought for our time, we'd talk a little bit about, why do we advocate? What's the point? As well as hear a message from a Congress member. And we'll talk a little bit about what the difference between coordinated advocacy and just kind of individual advocacy, because it really is interesting and makes a difference. And then I'll just talk briefly about a couple of campaigns, the Farm Bill campaign that Brett has worked on for the last year and a half, and the Nourish Our Future campaign. And then there are a few suggestions or items or descriptions of things that churches do in ministry with us, and see if any of those resonate or don't resonate or pique your interest, and we want to talk more about those. And then I'll be asking you some questions, and you can ask me questions. But why don't we just begin briefly in prayer. So let me pray. Lord God, we pray that you would speak through us, move through us, guide us to be your hands and feet of love and of compassion in seeking justice in this world in ways that please you. In your name, amen. Amen. Well, let's put this to the test. I'll click that and see if it goes. Oh, it did. Oh, excellent. Okay. Well, that's my question really for you all. So, why can't we just do this ourselves in our churches and charities? Why do we involve the government? Any thoughts?
They're slow.
The speed, the slow. So you think which is slow?
Brain-wise and action-wise.
Okay.
Yeah, because of the Farm Bill, which resonates within the government, is another place where we really need to concentrate on.
Sure.
So the future farmers of America, because that's the young group.
Yep.
That'll eventually be the bread and butter that we thrive on.
Right.
So local churches and charities are not systemic enough. They might help this area or that area, but the problem is much bigger and systemic than that.
Those are the great answers.
Because the government is us. And so if we want to do it, then we do it. And the government is ours.
And if it's not, then we need to remind them, right? Yes. Peacefully. Yes. That's excellent. Those are all great answers. Well, let me ask a follow-up question, then I'm going to come back to your answers. Let's imagine that all of the food donated to people who need food, or even money, spent to buy food for people who need food, is either private or public. What is private or public? So let's imagine that is a percentage. And so what percent do you suppose is private, and what percent do you suppose is public? Like 50-50 or some other numbers. And so let's define private as all of our food banks, our food pantries, our charities, our churches, our supermarkets who give, everyone who's giving and donating, individuals. And then the public would be things like, food stamps, which is called SNAP, school meals, federal nutrition programs, all that kind of thing. So give me someone throw out some percentages, private, public.
80-20.
So 80 private, 20 public. Oh, sorry, okay, so 20-80. I was gonna go private first. Okay, 20-80. Anyone else?
I think people and 75% and 25% the government, because they
Sure. So 75% private, 25% public. Okay, any more? Well, and I am derelict. I did not bring fair trade chocolate to kind of toss like we're at a ball game to the winners, because the closest one, because I know, sorry, but the next slide will actually show us that it's actually $10.90, and it used to be $5.95. So only 5% comes from the private sector. Only now 10% comes from the private sector. So as much as we do in our churches and our charities and food banks, and it's terribly important, that other part, that larger block, is public. So when our elected leaders talk about cutting those programs, or as you say, unfortunately, if they waste money somewhere, it's really costly because it affects people who are vulnerable to hunger. So that's notable. And this also speaks to one of the categories of answers for me. For me, there are a lot of reasons why we advocate, and you named really good answers, and I put them in some categories. And sometimes one of the categories is size and scope, and I think some of your things got to that. But there's some size and scope example. And we could also talk about that globally as well, but I'll say that and see if anyone wants to ask later. Another category is, sometimes we have a bad law or a bad policy, and so we need a new law or a new policy to undo that bad law. And so that's where it helps to actually, write the new bill. And I have colleagues who have helped write bills or influence bills and work with both sides of the aisle. By the way, I should say that up front about Bread for the World. When we help someone in Congress introduce a bill or if we work with them, we have historically only done that if we can get leaders from both major parties to agree together. So we just don't want to get involved in the party bickering, the partisanship that goes on. So instead, we get folks from both major parties to work together, and then if they're going to launch a bill, then we can support that. But one way, sometimes when people design laws, they think, well, we're thinking of inputs, like, well, everyone needs this, so let's just put these out there. Like, let's on the graphic on the right, what if you gave the same bicycle to everyone? Well, does that work? Well, for the disabled person, it doesn't work. For the tall person, it's too short. For the child, it's too tall. But if you think in terms of, impact, output, what is the word I'm looking for? You have equity reflects when you have a disabled cycle for a disabled person, a taller bike for the taller person, and a smaller bike for the child. So really looking at the impact or how it plays out rather than what we're equally putting into something. I think that's useful for us in writing in better laws. And the corn, I'll come back to that if people want to talk about that. And then third, there's just a biblical call to advocacy. I mentioned during worship that 50 years ago, the folks who studied the Bible together came to see that advocacy, they were called to speak out. And one of the ways they came to see that was they looked at the story of the burning bush. God hears the cries of God's people. God calls Moses and later Aaron and sends them to Pharaoh on what? A mission of political advocacy. God sent God's servants to the leader of the day to let my people go, set my people free, not to take up a collection of blankets or relief supplies or emergency things, which probably would have been very valuable then. They're valuable today following floods and disasters and all those kinds of things. I lived 6 years in Nicaragua as a PCUSA mission worker, and we had every natural disaster you could imagine. I got there months too late. I just missed the tidal wave, but I was there for a 30-year drought, for earthquakes, for volcanic eruptions, for massive storms, Hurricane Mitch, you name it. So we know those supplies and relief things are precious. At the same time, and our food pantries are precious, but at the same time, we're called to speak out in ways that can overcome that. And so we have actually I have it in a brochure if anyone wants, but a little brochure on the biblical basis for advocacy to end hunger. So I'll have a couple of these here if anyone wants to take a look at that. But I think that's an important category. I'd say, why do we advocate? We'd say because the Bible tells us so. So here we have a short video, very short video from a member of Congress, and we have these on our website. We have short videos, like just a minute long or so, from Republicans and Democrats. This person happens to be a Democrat, but it's just a really good video because she herself used to be at a church that was writing letters to Congress and working with Bread for the World. So let's see if this...
I'm Shahana Hayes, Congresswoman for Connecticut's 5th Congressional District. Before coming to Congress, I was the person at my church who collected letters to send to legislators for Bread for the World. As a member of Christ CME and the larger CME Connectional Ministry, I collected thousands of letters to send to legislators asking them to do something to end global hunger. Today, I'm on the receiving end of those letters. Thousands of letters come to members of Congress, and I see that passion and commitment and advocacy still exists. I sit on the Committee of Agriculture and the Subcommittee of Nutrition and Foreign Agriculture. So I see all of the work that you're doing, and I know that Congress has the ability to make the investments to end global hunger. So thank you. Keep your letters coming, keep your advocacy going, and help us to make people understand and appreciate that we have the ability and the capacity to end world hunger. We just need the will and partners like you. So thank you for all of the work you do to make sure that children around the world do not go to bed hungry. I'm Shahana Hayes.
She said she's a member of the House Agriculture Committee, which is the committee that works on the Farm Bill, and she was just able to introduce something from Bread for the World at a hearing they had and say that my friends at Bread for the World want you to know such and such, and kind of add that to the testimony. One of the things we try to do at Bread for the World is to make this easy. We like to make it easy and effective for people to advocate. And so we have trainings, we have things, printed material to offer. For example, we have here like a 6-part Bible study series. So sometimes the church will take that and say, we're going to use 2 or 3 weeks of that. And they'll have a Bible study series leading up to a point where at the end of it, they'll go ahead and say, okay, I think we're ready to write some letters to our senators or to our House members about this hunger issue that you're working on this year. And that's just helpful for people to have discussions in context and not feel rushed into anything for the first time. We also have a little Advocacy 101 brochure, and of course we have things on our website that are available to look at. We just like to have resources for people to try and answer questions, but basically, over the calendar, we want to help people to, if they want to write letters to Congress, if they want to have a face-to-face meeting, if they want to make what we call smart calls, where you say, I actually want to talk to the staff member who works on this issue. And I say, I've got a directory, here's her name. And so I'll give you, her name and number, and you call her. Or you could send her an email, because I'll have her specific email address. So we try to make it as easy as we can for people to advocate and be effective. I'll click one more. Let me give an illustration of I'd say coordinated advocacy. Several years ago in Iowa, Senator Chuck Nussel was head of the Budget Committee. He was chair of the Budget Committee. And Chuck made what I would call an unfortunate announcement. He decided to remove $1 billion, that's with a B, $1 billion from funds that I would call poverty-focused development assistance. So that's not aid to Egypt or Israel or something, or Russia back in the day, but it was poverty-focused poverty-focused assistance. And he took $1 billion out, saying the people of Iowa just don't care about people in Africa or in the developing world. That's not a priority, so we're going to remove this. Well, some people in Iowa felt a little differently. So there were a lot of Bread members in Iowa. And so rather than just kind of do things individually or randomly, they organized. And so the people who were comfortable writing letters began writing letters, and he got a lot of letters. The people who were more comfortable on the phone made phone calls, and he and his office got a lot of phone calls. Some people were good at writing op-eds or letters to the editor, and so they wrote those and got those published in a couple of different newspapers, so that was getting attention. Also, a number of people said, well, let's meet. Let's actually meet his office. So they had a grassroots meeting representing more than a dozen different churches, so that it wasn't just people from one congregation, but an ecumenical body that met and talked with his staff. And then they said, let's cap this one. Let's go one level higher. And so they set up what I would call a grass tops meeting. So the Lutherans, the Catholics, the Methodists got their bishops involved. The Presbyterians talked to the executive presbyter. Everybody got their kind of highly placed religious figure, and they had a grass tops meeting with the senator himself, and those folks pointed out all the letters he'd been getting, all the calls he'd been getting. It was the kind of the final step, and he backed off. Senator Grassley kind of stepped back. I guess the people of Iowa do, in fact, care about their sisters and brothers. And he put that $1 billion back in to that account. Now, that money went overseas to fund potable water projects, wells, building wells, inoculating children, I mentioned that earlier, building clinics, building schools, really powerful development things. Things that no small community in a rural part of a developing country is going to survive or build without. So I think the people of Iowa actually saved lives. I think they made a huge difference of people's lives and communities around the world. We call them heroes, we call them advocates. So, and I think there may be an opportunity in the next 10 months in this country, in this state, in Idaho, to have that same kind of showdown or come to Jesus with Senator Crapo on the child tax credit. So there's an interesting opportunity coming up. Well, let me talk a little bit about the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is a big, big bill. It's massive. It affects a lot of people. It comes up every 5 years, though at the pace Congress works, it ends up being every 6 years. But it covers not just farming and agriculture, it covers forestry, it covers conservation, it covers SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which we know is food stamps. It covers overseas spending on hunger. So it has some specific programs that fall in there that go overseas for Food for Peace and other programs that are food aid. So it covers a lot of things that address hunger. And so we get involved every year, but it also has some real opportunities to shape not just agriculture, but food systems in our country. And so Bread saw some real opportunities this time around. And so we realized there was a chance to weigh in not only on hunger and nutrition, but on racial equity in food systems, on climate change and earth care. Some of us care deeply about earth care, and global hunger as well. So I've really boiled those down to those are simplified kind of asks, things we're asking of Congress. But when we actually meet with them and send the material, it's much more specific than that. But that boils it down. We really are trying to make food stamps more nutritious through some programs called GUSNIP, which is a nutrition assistance incentives program. There are a lot of ways to protect and restore the earth. For example, there is a bill out there, a couple of bills on food waste, bipartisan bills on food waste. I mean, food waste is never a good thing, but it happens too much in this country. Sometimes up to 40% of food gets wasted. And that waste, not only that food doesn't go to people who need it, but then it goes into landfills, creates methane emissions, and that methane is a leading driver of climate change and other kinds of problems. And it's leading to depleting our soil, less zinc and less iron in the soil. So some of you in the room probably know far more about that than I do. But I do understand that's a serious problem. There are a lot of other problems. We know that some indigenous peoples, some tribes would be better served if they were able to administer food stamps, SNAP, on their own reservations rather than going to this office and then you go to that office and then you go to this place and that, it becomes this big dance. And so some sovereignty in that issue would be really useful. We also have been working on something with Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico's in one kind of program now, and we'd like to move it from NAP to SNAP, just adding an S. But it's more than that. So we're still working on that. And of course, this is a tricky one, but most developed nations around the world, if there's a food crisis in Ethiopia, in Denmark, they're not shipping food to Ethiopia. You go to the parts of Ethiopia where the farmers are working, or you go next door to Uganda, the land of plenty. I visited Uganda, and that was anyway, they had many good nicknames for Uganda. And you buy the food there and distribute it in Ethiopia. Most church organizations, like Peace USA, I believe, and other church structures work that way. Most developed nations work that way, but no, not the US. because the shipping lobby has been really effective on this, and they keep getting us to spend 50% of the whole budget on shipping food about 4 times a year. It could take 17 weeks to get there to a food hotspot instead of just buying it locally. And sometimes when we ship food overseas, the food gets to a place and it isn't handled well, and so it gets dumped, and so we end up driving local farmers in Ethiopia out of business, and then we're perpetuating the problem. It's maddening. So if I've gotten on a soapbox, I apologize. This is just one of those things, like, before I die, like, I really, really, really want this fixed. And so we've at Bread for the World, we've been working on that for years, and we still hope to take that on. Well, let me move on. So this is the campaign, as we're wrapping up the Farm Bill work this month in June, and Congress seems to be moving forward at last. We're preparing for our Nourish the Future campaign, where we're looking at most effective ways to end childhood hunger and also to address college hunger. Because it's a little startling. College hunger shocks me still. I mean, I've been with Bread for a long time, but I'm still startled by the idea that anyone in college is going without meals, other than my son, who seems to make choices that way. But anyway, so we have a few steps to do that. We're having listening sessions. A lot of churches are hosting listening sessions. We're figuring out who's going to work with us in Congress. We'll pass a platform and move forward. And I'll get to some of that later in just a few minutes. But I said there were a few things that churches do with us in ministry, and one of them is to host a listening session. So you could do that if you wanted to do that, and I've got a slide on that. Or there's the racial wealth gap learning simulation. I've got a slide on that. You know, meeting with their senators this summer, that's well timed, or even in the fall. And then organizing some kind of letter writing where we gather, we write letters, and we pray over those letters and send those off. But let's talk about the listening session for just a moment. So how Bread envisions a listening session is to listen to you, not inviting you to come listen, but to present a little bit of material about different programs like WIC, the child tax credit, other programs going on, and see which programs resonate most with you. Which ones do you think that Bread should be highlighting or emphasizing in this campaign, Nourish Our Future? Then we also invite you to share stories, because some of you may have experienced hunger in your home or household or in your neighborhood, your family. Some of you may have been volunteering at food pantries and seeing people with examples of food insecurity. And those stories are just so precious. If we can lift up those stories to our elected leaders, they need to hear them, because I think folks in Washington are really far removed from those kind of realities. And so the more we can carry a real story to Washington, the better. I mean, this sounds crass, and I apologize, but stories like that, an actual personal story, is like currency, like gold in Washington, D.C. And that's the most precious thing that we'll have to offer in any congressional meeting. I would love for Southminster to think about doing this. This is a colleague of mine developed this racial wealth gap learning simulation. And I try hard not to call it a game, but I could just give myself a break and call it a game. I try not to use the G word, but it looks like a game because you're seated around a table, you're in different roles, you're taking turns, and you go through different scenarios, and you're going to win things and lose things in different stages with different scenarios. But it's so informative, and it's very powerful. And you learn how a racial wealth gap was actually created in this country. And we try not to get, go down the rabbit hole of why did this happen? And we try to look at the outcome. Like when I was talking earlier about equity, the outcome, and just recognize the outcome. So how can we reverse that? How can we change that so we don't have this outcome of creating a greater and greater wealth gap? But it leads to some very good conversation. And it's not a lecture format, it's really a you're talking format. You have the printed cards and you're going through them, or if we do it remotely, then you have electronic things we're looking at with a slideshow and you can follow along. But you want to stop and talk about it at many steps along the way. So I hope you'd be interested in trying that, and that'd be even something we could partner with other congregations if they were interested. Now, not too long from now, June 10 and 11, Monday and Tuesday, Bread will be inviting or gathering with people from all around the country. And we're coming to Washington, D.C. to go have meetings on Capitol Hill, and we can tell them, hey, I've flown 3,000 miles, 1,500 miles. I've come all this way to meet with you, Senator, and a lot of them will sit down and really listen. And every year, we win some victories in those moments. It's a powerful day. Now, that's awfully soon now, but we would love for you to think about June 2025. I would love to have an Idaho mob there, friendly mob. Say peaceful mob, loving, Christ-loving mob. I'm just emphasizing it. But yes. But we don't always have to go to Washington. We can do that right here. The advent of Zoom, because of the pandemic, it's much easier than it used to be to get meetings with our elected leaders. So we can sit down with them on Zoom, and we can just go and see them at their offices in Boise. So these are things I'd invite you to do, and I have trainings that we can provide for effective advocacy. Maybe some of you have done this already many times, but there are certainly practical kind of best practices that we could follow. And then finally, organizing letter writing. If and when the congregation felt it was ready to do that, to look at some of our sample letters, figure out what's resonating with you, or maybe we have a couple of different issues we could write about. Well, maybe not this one today, but this one is what we're really focused on. And then we can do that. I can provide different sample letters and different ideas, and we look at those letters and we just sit down and write some letters. Or it could be electronic. Sometimes there's actually at a Presbyterian church in Southern California, they've now reverted to, or transitioned to just only having electronic offerings of letters. So they'll have a few computers set up, people are bringing their phones, they set everyone up in advance, and everyone just does things electronically. And then sometimes on college campuses, I've gone and visited, and the students have just filmed themselves. They've filmed themselves speaking for 30 seconds, 45 seconds, 60 seconds at the most, and then they've uploaded the video to the senator's website. It's a great way to speak out. So there are a lot of ways to go about this. And you can involve young people too. When I visit Congress, which is probably more often than I care to admit over the last few years, I often see handwritten letters and even crayon drawings from children on the wall. So those letters get noticed regardless of age. So we even have, sometimes I've tailored sample letters for kids and sent them out because they're a little more direct. And then sometimes churches have said, you can stop sending the adult letters, we'll just take the kid ones because everyone likes those better. They're just a little more direct. And sometimes my colleagues write these letters that sound like they're written by policy wonks because they were. So, bless them. Well, let me just pause there and see if there are any questions or concerns or just anything you wonder about. I'll put this down. But what kind of questions does all of this prompt? That was a lot of different things to say at once. Please.
I was thinking about Gaza right now,
Mm-hmm.
and the food that's being shipped to be put on this platform, the U.S. bill
Right.
busted. Does that food come clear from the United States, or where is that coming from, I wonder?
Right. And if this is being live streamed, I'm going to repeat the question the best I can. So we're asking about the food that's going to people in Gaza and delivered to those platforms, and other foods being trucked in. Is that food being shipped? And I'd say yes. Yes, that's actually some food that we're shipping. And the thing is that farmers in the U.S., there are a lot of farmers in the U.S. that take a lot of pride in knowing that they're growing crops that are going to go to hungry people. So I have no beef with those farmers. That's fantastic. I'm not too happy about the shippers, who are making off with 50% of the budget. But so that is true. Now, I don't know for certain. It's possible that some of that food is being purchased elsewhere. So I probably have to get back to you to be sure. But I am certain that a certain percentage of it is coming from the U.S. directly here. So food that'll be going to, and Gaza is obviously one of the hunger hotspots. I mean, the South Sudan, Gaza, Haiti, there are 4 or 5 spots right now where people are really, really facing hunger and possible famine.
So when you were talking kind of about the idea of, buying food locally and other parts of the world where hungry people, and kind of
Sure.
the research that's gone behind all of that. Is that all people that are in your organization that do that kind of research? And where do those people come from? And
That's good.
Yeah.
So Ann was asking for the live stream again. Ann was asking about, who's doing the research that leads us to think that, it'd be better to buy locally overseas through a program actually called Local and Regional Purchase, LRP. Some of those people are working for Bread for the World. There's Bread and the Bread Institute. We have an institute that is kind of our research group. And so they publish a hunger report annually, and they do some great research, and they do a lot of interviews of people in the country or interviews overseas. Remember the 2015 edition was Exceptional Hunger Report, where they laid out the understanding that to address hunger globally, that women needed to be accounted for as change agents, that discrimination against women and girls in so many countries in the world was actually perpetuating hunger, and that when women were empowered as change agents of addressing hunger, that turned things completely. So we do research, but we also work with local partners. I mean, Bread for the World Institute is reaching out to people overseas who learn these lessons. So for example, I know a young woman who now lives in California, where she's connected to, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Orange, but she's from Rwanda, and she will get on a soapbox and talk to you about how shipping food from another country to that local country is often a disaster. Sometimes the food is culturally inappropriate, and so people aren't ready to eat that food. Even if they're hungry, it's strange for them, and doesn't feel safe, and it may not work digestively for them. Sometimes the food, as she points out too often, the food will wipe out local producers. So we have kind of first-person testimony from people who have come to us, but we also have a lot of sources overseas as well as our research team. Yeah.
Are there any food deserts in the Pacific Northwest?
Are there any food deserts in the Pacific Northwest? I imagine there are, but I'm not expert enough on the Pacific Northwest to answer that. I mean, food desert, I've heard a lot of different terms. Food desert was a common term. I've heard things about food swamps now, but there are certainly areas where where people don't have easy access to healthy food. And so there are areas where people don't have a good supermarket or a farmer's market or some kind of produce opportunity to get to, and that's really hurtful, because then they're gonna, well, this gets to the Farm Bill, where one of the problems with the Farm Bill is that we subsidize certain crops that end up being in processed foods, as opposed to, you don't hear a lot of subsidies for broccoli. And again, this is not a farmer's fault. This is policy being set by the U.S. government. I mean, farmers have to do what's working. So there are clearly places where people are in need. I just couldn't identify the towns for you. I couldn't identify neighborhoods because I'm not expert enough in the Pacific Northwest landscape. But one of the things that Bread works on is, and this is great because we're hearing support from both major parties on this, but I mentioned GusNIP. That's a program named for a late Republican congressman from Maryland, Gus Schumacher. And so NIP stands for Nutrition Incentive Program. And GusNIP exists in every state, but they have different names for it in different states. It's like double up bucks. Does that sound familiar to anyone here? Some states in the Pacific Northwest call it double up bucks. They do in Montana at least. And it's a way for, if someone is a food stamps beneficiary, they can use their EBT card at a farmer's market or at a produce market and get double the value. And that's fantastic because we already know the system is rigged so that that healthy produce is more expensive than McDonald's or more expensive than junk food. Because the system is, so it's a one way to kind of offset that unfortunate rigging of the system where we're still subsidizing the wrong things, too much of the wrong things, in my opinion.
You mentioned a specific example of Senator Crapo and the child tax credit. What are the best resources for us to educate ourselves on the issue? We do want to get involved and write letters.
Sure. I mean, I should start with our own website, but I won't keep to that. And for the live stream, we're talking about what are some good resources to educate ourselves on these issues. So Bread for the World, with our website, bread.org, so it's pretty simple, bread.org. We try to keep up on that. And of course, I would love to be a personal resource so someone can email me. And I wonder if I have my email on this or not. I may not. Oh, sorry, I don't. But beyond that, there are different good sources, I think. For instance, say the Center on Budget and Policy. But I could write some down, and I could send them to Anne, and she could distribute them. I'm trying to think. On the child tax credit, I'd have to look on my computer and see what I have open, to be honest, because I've got a number of things.
Just do something as simple as Google child tax credit.
Yeah.
And then, look at various things that pop up that you might be able to click on and educate. Because I have the same question. I mean, if I'm going to go meet, and I know you guys provide some training materials in terms of personal advocacy, but I'm kind of like you. I want to educate myself more about what are the kinds of ins and outs of the child tax credit before I start going and talking to some senator who I perceive as more of an authority than me, which may or may not be true. But if I want to be a good advocate, I want to be educated enough to understand what I'm talking about.
We won't send people in uninformed. Like for our gathering, for our lobby day in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday the 11th of this month, I mean, we've been sending material to people who are coming. They've been reading up, and then that morning we'll have a whole kind of primer on that and go in informed. Though I would say, of course you want to read and be prepared. Of course you want to feel comfortable with what you're talking about. And we can help you with our own material as well as point you to other sources. So I just I'd have to have my computer open to be able to answer that question better. But I would still say you don't have to be a policy expert. In fact, that's not the most important thing when you step into the room. It's not the most important thing to be a policy expert. The most important thing is to be authentic and to bring your stories. And that's really what matters with them. Whenever we go on these meetings, we always bring printed material, what we call a leave behind packet, and they're expecting it. They say, you have something for us? And, so we share what we want to share, but we leave behind that printed material so that frees us up in the time we have to share the stories, to tell them why we care, because that's really what matters. Why do you care about this? Why is this on your heart? And I have too many examples of that, but we've had a number of meetings out in California as well as in Washington, D.C., where people were able to win someone over because they showed how deeply they cared and they shared the right story. And that's so essential. Pastor?
It seems like one of the things that sets Bread apart from other agencies is that part of what makes the organization tick is a connection to Christian spirituality and to a language of faith that sometimes seems to get lost in the shuffle. You give the example of early on of how reading the Bible led to things like WIC, for example.
Yeah.
Can you give other examples of what it looks like to walk into the room, to advocate, and to tell a story, even a story that comes from a position of, as a person of faith, I am compelled to speak because. How does that change the dynamic, if at all? Have you seen any stories or any examples of that nature?
Yeah, I mean, even the story I told of Senator Nussel, that he knew he was hearing from faith leaders, whether it was people in the church and then the bishops and the higher placed people, but that they use faith language in their letters, in their phone calls, in their face-to-face communication, and that was important. But we do that pretty regularly. I mean, there was a senator, was it from Nebraska, Chuck, I should know his name, but I apologize, but it's been a few years. And there was an example of where we kind of worked up the food chain. We did two things with him. He was a Republican from Nebraska, a senator, and he began by not, like we couldn't even get meetings at his office, the folks in Nebraska, and then they eventually kind of got meetings with the interns. And then they kept going, and every step of the way they were using faith language, and they were making it clear that people in that area were called by Christ to speak out to him. And they eventually worked their way up and met with Senator Chuck. What's that? Well, that was too, well, anyway, I'm confusing names, so that's a sign of my own. But anyway, at the end, he not only came on board and started supporting our bills, he came on our board of directors, because we always have a couple of Democrats and a couple of Republicans on our board of directors at all time, because we're sending that message to the rest of Congress. We're not on one side or the other. We're encouraging you to work together. So faith language was a big, big part of that. But there's one other example that might answer that question, Pastor. There was and this is now about 20 years ago, there was a newly elected member of the House in a little further east of us in the Farm Belt. And we, again, couldn't get their attention. And so someone held an offering of letters at their church. And they wrote those letters in, and the staff member who wouldn't talk to our bread leader in the area actually contacted the bread leader, a little bit of a panic, and said, I got a ton of letters on this stuff. All you church people are really worked up about it. What's going on? I don't know about this issue. And so we started educating that staff member, and then educating the rest of the staff, and then educating that Congress member, and that Congress member started supporting our bills. But all the time, Brett always wanted to know, so when you say ton of letters, like how many was it? Because we want to know what that tipping point is. Was it like when you hit 600 or a couple of thousand? Like we just, and the staff member for Congress was kind of embarrassed, and he didn't want to give us that information. Maybe he'd gotten a little too nervous. Well, he eventually admitted it. It was 8 letters. Just 8 letters weighed a ton to him. 8 letters got his attention, got him nervous, because he realized, I don't know about this stuff. My colleagues don't know about this stuff, so he wanted to get informed. So people using, I'm hearing a lot of echo, and I hope that's okay for you all. That's why I keep moving over here to get out of that. But 8 letters was a ton of letters, and I think because people were using faith language, because they were speaking from the heart, because they shared why they cared and how they cared and what they wanted done, and that's what we always want to say. Here's who I am. Here's why I care. Here's what I want you to do. You know, co-sponsor this bill, or vote yes on this in the such and such committee, or do everything in your power to make sure this, or sometimes we'll say, I know you're not on this committee, but I want you to talk to your colleagues on that committee and make sure they do A, B, and C. So we can give them very specific instructions, but we always want them to know where we're coming from. And sometimes in meetings, we'll close a meeting with a member of Congress and say, would it be okay if we pray for you? And just to ask to make sure that's all right. And if that's all right with them, well, then we'll pray, because they've got challenging jobs. I mean, they're hearing from a lot of people about a lot of things. There's pressure. And so we want to pray for them that they could hear God's voice guiding them. So, yeah?
I would say that's one of the things that I think has really been really encouraging to me. So, a month and a half or 2 months ago when we first connected online, I went to the website and I joined. And subsequent to that, I've gotten several emails and invitations to participate in a national kind of Zoom prayer time with other people in the organization to end hunger. Or for this upcoming week, there's a mindful fasting time that you can engage in. And then I think it's Wednesday, June 5th, and the evening is another Zoom prayer time with other people in Bread for the World, too. And so for me, it really has been great in terms of that spiritual education. Yeah, there's work to do and advocacy, and I'm all up for that. But for me, tying those two together in a way to help keep me more mindful of why I'm doing this, because you can find work to do everywhere, but the whole spiritual aspect of it has been really phenomenal, and I really appreciated that.
That's good. Thank you, Ann. That's a great point. I mean, we are We are a Christian movement. We call ourselves a Christian movement seeking an end to hunger through education and advocacy. And so we're speaking to elected leaders, but we always know who we are. And we partner with faith groups that are not Christian, because we have different times when there's an interfaith kind of context. In fact, this 6-part Bible study series, Hunger No More, and I'm happy to leave that here, one of our funders for that is Maison, a Jewish response to hunger. And I've lobbied with folks from Maison many times. They're really good. But there's a real shared concern around hunger. And we've had moments in California, actually on the Farm Bill many years ago, when someone in Congress told me the Farm Bill runs through, the Cotton Belt runs through Oklahoma, Texas, and Barbara Boxer, who was at that time senator for California. And I thought, well, okay. And they said, you're never going to get her. We got her. And we got her because we approached her in an interfaith way, because we realized we needed to be way bigger. California's a big state, a very populous state. And so when we had an interfaith group speaking out to her and using language that was appropriate for an interfaith group, and that was an education for me, then we actually won her over and won her out of the cotton lobby and to support serious reforms to the Farm Bill. And people in DC were pretty shocked. So it's satisfying when you can pull these things off, but I think starting with our faith is the right place. Other questions or thoughts? I'd invite you to think about, I wonder if I can go backwards on this thing. Wow, it does, look at that. Well, I'd invite you especially to think about this, because it's such an interesting source of education and information, and at the same time, it's a great on-ramp. I mean, I used to facilitate this in person more often, and then, COVID and the pandemic happened, and so I started doing it more on Zoom, and I've probably facilitated over 50 times on Zoom, but sometimes even with high school students. And that's heavy stuff for high school students. So on Zoom, we would always take a lot of breaks after part 4, after part 8, just every so often take some breaks and have people stop and check in, go to breakout rooms and really check in. But if you're doing it in person, then you're going to be checking in along the way. Some tables are going to go faster than others because we're going to have the chatty table and we're going to have the stunned to silence table. And it's, please.
Is this just like a scenario kind of thing where you get a card that says you're the farmer and you get a card that says...
No, it's more, you're asking about scenarios. The simulation is more historical scenarios. So it's taking 13 moments in time, 13 moments in U.S. history, and I could have brought a packet, sorry. 13 moments in U.S. history and how this policy, like the GI Bill is number 8. How that was implemented, what that did, and how that created a racial wealth gap. And so there are different opportunities. There are things that kind of come in the Reconstruction period. If you know U.S. history following the Civil War, then we had another great crisis when we had the Great Depression and the Wall Street crash and all the aftermath of that. And so there are a lot of moments when there are crises in the country and the country's rebuilding, and yet when you see what the choices that have been made, you think, oh, we're rebuilding in ways that they're creating that racial wealth gap, and we don't have to do that. So how can we not do that in 2024? But anyway, this would be great. You could facilitate. You don't need me. You could facilitate it yourselves. We have a whole packet online, and I could mail you stuff. Or if you wanted to do it with me, I'd either do it when I came back sometime or do it remotely over Zoom. So kind of your choice. But it's just something to think about, because I think it's really powerful. Any other questions? We've probably kept you. These guys back have been working all morning, so.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you all. Well, thank you. Thank you, guys. Well, I'll just say I've left a few things on the front pew.
Yes, thank you.
If anyone's interested, if some people really like QR codes, so have at it. We've got QR codes to take you to different things. some forms you could fill out if you want to hold a listening session, a couple of brochures, and I'll stop. So just
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Ann.
That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.